Welcome back, everyone. There is a nice bit of thread of continuity from the last session or the end of it, because Matthew was talking about or giving an example of the role of, I suppose, creativity and a culture in relation to the seismic policy challenge of biodiversity loss. Well, we're going to carry on talking about culture and indeed creativity in this session. Here we're going to be focused more on the role and importance of cultural institutions and the arts more generally, particularly how policymakers should think about and act on the value of those institutions at a time when the economy is flagging, when public resources are scarce. And that it's a very broad landscape that we'll have a go at. I mean, it encompasses a number of other questions, such as how should we think about and measure the social and economic value of heritage sites, museums, and other kinds of cultural provision and activity. Now, at the Bennett Institute, we've become quite interested in these questions, really on the back of work we've been doing for a while about social infrastructure and its importance in communities, particularly poorer communities, and that's led us to sort of think about some of the cultural venues and facilities and spaces that are very important to community life. And in particular, we have a strand of work that's developed which is looking at the role and value of museums. And there's a piece we're doing in conjunction with the National Association of Museum Directors on the different kinds of value that museums create. And I think that's going to lead up to a report that will be published in a couple of months. So those are the issues. We've got a really good panel, I think, to kick these issues around. I'm going to work down the line from the other end. I'm going to start with James Pennell. James, you're currently President and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Arts London, but also in some of the interesting previous lives that you've had, you have also had experience of exactly these issues, both in your role as Director of Strategy and at radio at BBC, and then before that, as a Labour MP who became Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. So can I just ask you to reflect on this question? What's the value? How do you understand, or think we should understand the value that cultural institutions can generate in periods of economic crisis and social recession?
Yes, good question. So I mean, the language matters a bit here, so I'll talk a bit about, I think, creativity as well as culture. And sort of reflecting back on the last few years, I think in many ways culture got us through a lot of the lockdown. You know, Grayson Perry, who's our Chancellor, always makes the point, what did we do in COVID? Well, people sat at home and they consumed culture, whether that was Netflix or, you know, I'm sure we all lived up to our commitment to reread all of Proust, which we all made to ourselves at the start of...
we'll be testing that later,
yeah.
won't we?
Then I think culture makes sense of it, doesn't it? You know, go back and look at every crisis in our history, and there's contemporaneous culture, and there's culture afterwards, which will help us understand and come to terms and move forward. So culture, you know, has huge intrinsic benefits in terms of moments of social and economic crisis. And I always think you have to start with those, because if you go to the instrumentalization of culture straight away, you forget why it matters, and indeed the instrumentalization doesn't work unless you know, the culture has intrinsic value. But I also think that creativity and culture actually have got a real instrumental role in taking us forward. You know, the creative industries are 6% of the economy. The economy overall hasn't really grown since the start of COVID. We haven't really recovered that lost growth, whereas the creative industries have grown quite significantly, just under 10% since then. So they're an engine of growth in themselves. And we'll talk a bit about this when we talk about ways of measuring well-being and culture. I also think there's something fundamental and economy-wide that creativity and culture does to a country like the UK, to many other countries, which is, I think, it creates adventurous consumers and creative workers. And that's not just in the creative industries. You know, most people from UAL do not go and work in the creative industries. Most graduates, they go and work in a wide range of industries. And again, there's an illusion between creativity and innovation. But post-Brexit, what is it that the UK has? Creativity is absolutely one of the fundamental things, and culture is one of the parts of social capital that makes that real. Now, it can get a bit nebulous. It's obviously harder to put numbers on, but it is, absolutely vital to the country. And I sort of yearn a bit for a kind of national approach to this. There's a good example of Paul Keating when he was the Labour Prime Minister in Australia, who had a framework document called Creative Nation, where creativity wasn't just the kind of thing that politicians had to be reminded to mention. It was the thing that they were trying to use to propel Australia forward. Obviously, we can debate whether that ended up being more or less important than raw materials and mineral wealth, but I think there's an argument for doing that in the UK as well.
So just to follow up on that, it's a very sort of striking way to think about creativity. So you want to not just have the creative industries in their own sort of silo, as it were, to think of that as a sector, but in some sense for us to think about creativity more widely. That very much plays against the sort of current of the policy debate, which in the UK focuses a lot on low skill levels and the sort of lack of investment in the workforce in different sectors. Just tell us a bit more about what is the creativity that's there that we're missing, or how can we enhance that? What are the sources of it? What are the manifestations of it?
Well, this is where creativity and innovation become slightly entangled, I would say. But certainly in UAL, we have 20,000 students. We send people out both with excellent craft skills. So if you come through UAL and do an animation course, you'll be excellent at all the craft skills that go with that profession. But you will have critical thinking skills as well. And so you will be able to think about your practice, and you will be able to then turn that into the kind of generally useful, innovative worker that you'll have in a company. And one of the things I'd love to see is a world in which you don't have to study PPE or SPS or whatever to end up being Prime Minister. You could do it having been a sculptor or having been someone who's a designer would be incredibly well suited to those skills. So it's slightly different from a more general concept of innovation, but I think it is kind of, in a way, it's maybe the kernel of it, and it's something the UK has a whole bunch of cultural and social capital, which leads to the bits of the industry where we are successful, I think, displays that kind of innovation and creativity. In the parts of the economy which are lower skill, lower productivity, I think there's a huge benefit and opportunity that comes from the Zoom revolution for those skills to be in YouTube and any technology we want to mention, for that to no longer be concentrated in metropolitan areas. And it's the narrative which goes against online education in HE, or against the idea that everyone has to be back at work, otherwise they're slackers, is actually, I think, missing out on a big opportunity for levelling up or reducing regional inequality, because those jobs just don't have to be in the centre of London, Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle anymore. They can be in all the places that policy is concerned about.
Great. Well, I definitely want to come back to that point about creativity and how we think about some of the issues we've talked about this morning, actually, about economic renewal in different parts of the country. But let me move to you, Rebecca. So, Rebecca, you're Chair of Urban Studies at the University of Glasgow, and also the Programme Director for the AHRC's Place-Based Research Programme. You've written a lot on post-heritage, particularly in post-industrial context. And I just wanted to, again, start with the same general question. What's your sense of how we should think about that broad question?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that crisis moments give us is an opportunity to reflect on what we value, what value is, what the meaning of that is. And so I think the key word for me in all of this is not value but meaning, and the relationship between those two things. And I think when we talk about value, we still, I think, predominantly focus on the economic value. We heard a lot about that today, and we shouldn't dismiss that in the slightest. But my remarks really are about how do we think about the relational value in the context of supporting economic value. And so my question is, why do we have cultural institutions and historic places that, in a sense, generate economic value? And that why question, I think, can be provoked in times of crisis. We really can sit down and think about it, think about how we use cultural places in particular ways. We've all experienced it in the lockdown, for example. And so to come back to the why question, I think my answer to this very much rests within a phrase that I think we subconsciously or intuitively know has value, but we don't perhaps use it, or we neglect our use of it, which is emotional value. And the way that places and cultural institutions and culture, intangible and tangible, matter to us as individuals, as part of a society, but also as part of place-based policies and practices. So I think the crisis gives us a chance to step back and ask that deep existential question that perhaps we don't have time in our day-to-day jobs to do in other ways. And I think to help me answer that question, I think about our cultural institutions and our historic places, not just as kind of geographic locations or GPS coordinates or material forms, for example, but actually as storehouses or containers of lived and felt everyday visitor experiences as well. These are the places that we return to day on day, if they're walking around them as part of our urban or rural environment, or places we choose to go to. And so I think what we're seeing there is that they are both generative of economic and emotional value, but also they receive emotional value from the kinds of decisions that we make as individuals to attend those kinds of places. There's an increasing amount of research within that kind of area about why they matter to us. And I think when we then sort of take that as our starting point and we say, well, emotion matters, fine. But in decision-making context, we probably kind of factor it out a little bit because we focus on the rational and the detached in the decisions we make. So what do I mean by emotion? If I think it's important, do I just mean the feelings that are provoked? So our anger, our pride we hear a lot about, our hope, fear, loss, whatever it might be. Yes, they're important. But I think we need to think about our emotional attachments to these kinds of cultural institutions, the deeper, the more profound relationships that us as individuals and as collectives have with these places and how that affects our decision making. So what our choices are, whether we choose to go to particular places, choose to live if we have choice, and what that does in the relationship to footfall and economic value. And I think the final part of the kind of emotion question really is how we coalesce into emotional communities. So how we coalesce around cultural institutions off the back of our particular kinds of responses and attachments, and how that brings us together in particular kinds of ways. You see it at moments of real crisis, perhaps when a local museum or gallery might be shutting down, or the potential loss of a historic building. There's lots of emotional communities coalesce around those spaces because they really matter to them. Yes, they matter for the instrumental reasons that James talked about, but they also matter for those intrinsic emotional reasons. And so I think when we talk about value, we should think about meaning, the emotional meaning that these places have for us. And I think the next question then is, how do you take that? If you accept that premise that emotion matters in culture and place, how do you take that and move it into, reframe it in the context of decision making? And I think that's the key stage that we're not quite at yet, but I'd be excited to see where it goes.
Great, and I want to try and get back to that point and put the question back to you three in a minute. Just before I do that, I think it's a very striking way in which you talk about cultural institutions or amenities, facilities, so to think about the emotional value they create. Now, if that is something that we make more central, do you think that might change our sort of calculation or estimation of which kinds of amenities and places and things matter? So can I give you an example from your work, which I thought was really interesting about the clock tower in the heart of Leicester, which I don't know if anyone knows that, but you might want to talk about that. I mean, you make a very powerful argument that is not particularly admired by the architectural community, but is an incredibly important place for many people. It's a gathering place, it performs all sorts of social functions. But that's not the sort of place that is, I assume, going to be part of a funding bid or figures is not top of mind for many policymakers. So can you just talk about that? What might be the implications of that argument?
I think so. I think when we talk about reframing, so how do emotional attachments reframe decision making? And I think I'll take it to an example that I know best, I think, which is perhaps what we might designate and look after in an official sense of the historic environment. And for years and years and years, centuries, we've designated based off architectural and historic value, and really important components. We should never seek to marginalise those. But I think with the example of, say, the clock tower, what you're seeing is that these cumulative everyday places are full of lived and felt experiences, not just what we're doing in those places, but how they make us feel. And we return to them time and time again if we want to, if we have choice. And perhaps we don't if we feel unsafe or uncomfortable in those kinds of areas. So I would like to see us move to a system where those kinds of everyday experiences are factored in to decisions about what we say is officially important, but also factored into the kinds of urban design and place-making initiatives that then are starting from a premise of what's strong in an area, what's working for people, what we're attached to, why we're attached to them, recognising the fluidity, that these things change over time and between people. And I think if we get to that starting point of what's strong in an area rather than a deficit, I think we'll have very different kinds of places, and the term that we return to time and time again is perhaps we'd have more place-sensitive policies and practices than perhaps we currently do.
And that works if policymakers, local, regional, or national, have a pretty deep understanding of the experience and lives of the people we're serving. So we'll come back to that as well, I hope. Let me move on, or move back to the cultural institutions bit then, with you, Tony. So Tony Butler has worked in museums for over 20 years, was a director of the Museum of East Anglian Life, so has kind of local connections here, but is currently executive director of Derby's Museums, and you've been in that post since 2014.
Yeah.
Your thoughts? So
places like museums or institutions like museums are popular. I mean, people like them, and they may not be, as institutions, they may not be, radical or forward-thinking, or some are, but they do hold that emotional pull, which you really articulated. Some of the things I was going to say. But on a really sort of granular level, they are open, they're free, they're often warm, and they're places that people want to congregate in, aside from that more engaged experience that you'll have from looking at cultural heritage and understanding the place that you live in, and then your place in the world. So the value of these institutions go from the very basic level of somewhere to go, and I think again that's been manifest quite a lot over the last 6 months or so, where lots of local authorities have asked museums or libraries to designate themselves as warm hubs, somewhere for people to go if they're having trouble with the cost of living. I mean, there's a conversation to have around whether that's a value or not, to something that is where they can become that kind of rallying point for a community. Especially in the last couple of years, what I found interesting is that the emotional argument as to whether a politician will support something has greater resonance than statistics. So, and that's not necessarily a good thing. I was in a meeting with a couple of councillors the other week, and the officers were bemoaning the fact that the council have a strategy for reducing the number of libraries in the city, because there are about 13 branch libraries, and some are very often not used. A councillor goes to visit a library and is berated by local people that want the library to stay open. The library usage, this particular library uses 350 books have been taken out of this library in the last year. So hardly used. But he then says to the local people, it's all right, I won't close your libraries. And so decision-making happens at that emotional level alongside some of the more statistical levels. So I think there's a how we frame all of that is quite interesting in making the case for culture. I think the LGA have just carried out a culture commission looking at the value of culture and the things that they support. They talk about civic infrastructure playing a really important role in engaging and empowering people and connecting them with others. So the best communities, the most networked communities, are the ones that have made that first step of enabling contact through culture and that special place. And then there's a range of other policy areas that, at local level especially, institutions like museums can attest to. So things like health and well-being, preventative health, a general feeling of subjective well-being amongst the community. They can support economic growth through the visitor economy and through training and skills. And something which I hope we can get to later, in our work in Derby, working with many of our industry partners, is focusing on skills development, especially for those 50% of the kids that won't go to university. Because they are the ones that often get left behind, but also they are the ones that would otherwise be filling a pipeline that many people in our local industry are saying they've got gaps. So our local employers are saying we can employ, the best educated people from all over the world, bring them to Derby. Where we have problems are that mid-range technical level of work. And 30, 40 years ago, through apprenticeships or through family connections, people in the community would fulfill those roles, and we're not being able to fulfill those roles now because of the skills gap. And that's something I think where cultural institutions can help deliver.
Can I just come back to you with the concept of creativity in mind that James tabled? So one of the most striking examples of exactly what you're saying in Derby, which I know you've been involved in, is the establishment of the Museum of Making. I mean, it'd be really interesting to hear you just talk a little bit about that and how that, in a way, illustrates some of those points. But also, I mean, what's striking about that, or one of the many things that's striking about that, is the focus on, I mean, it's obviously rooted in an account of Derby's past and rooted in certain traditions of manufacture, but is also very much a kind of forward-facing and contemporary-focused entity that talks about and encourages and promotes skills development, different making. Just tell us a bit about that and how that might be the kind of thing that...
So I have the pleasure of looking at Joseph Wright of Derby's orrery every day when I go into work. So this is a fabulous painting of a model of the universe. And the painting dates back from 1766, and it is the time when science and art and creativity are absolutely interlinked. And so we talk really vociferously about STEAM rather than STEM, so putting the arts into science, technology, engineering, arts and maths. So STEAM is the starting point for the work that we do. So the Museum of Making is based in Derby Silk Mill, which the original building dates back to 1721. It's part of the UNESCO Derwent Valley Mills World Heritage Site, and it's widely recognised as the site of the world's first factory. That's what we say in the publicity. No one's challenged me properly yet. So we've got a fantastic built asset in the community. So we have refurbished this building to create the Museum of Making, which is an £18 million project, lottery funded. But the concept behind this was to be asset-based and human-centred. So taking the assets that exist in the community and amplifying. So we've got these fantastic heritage assets, the building itself, our collections of cultural heritage, but there are also brilliant social networks that exist within the city. So Derby has Rolls-Royce, Toyota, and Alstom, planes, trains, and automobiles, all made in the city. It's a manufacturing centre, and we've got all these supply chains that work alongside those two. So virtually everybody, every family in the city will have a connection with engineering or and manufacturing. So it's a city full of technicians, it's a city full of engineers, and we worked with groups of makers, of creatives, of craftspeople to build this museum from the ground up. So we involved about 1,500 local people. It was about 35,000 volunteer hours that were brought together in creating this museum. And people were involved with working with architects. They worked with our exhibition designers right from the beginning. We built, instead of building galleries at the beginning, we built a workshop with CNC machines, laser cutters, 3D printers, as well as lathes and more sort of recognisable stuff you'd find in a workshop. And this became the kernel of the new museum. And it became a kind of rallying point for all these individuals and communities within the city that wanted to make. And we worked with groups like Derby Makers. We worked with individuals that would have access to the equipment, but in return give back something to our groups of other users. So we had one guy that would come in and he'd make bespoke skateboards and using our equipment, and he'd sell them for 300 quid a throw. But in return, he would train groups of year sixes to code. And he did a 10-week program working with these young people, encouraging them to code, which according to the last session is going out of fashion now. So perhaps we need to find a new thing for him to do. But it was that sense of that you're giving back so you're giving something back to this endeavour, as well as creating something new. So using that kind of that thinking, that human-centred thinking, we then worked alongside some of our major employers. And as I explained before, all our employers were saying to us, we have a problem with the pipeline, of people coming into those mid-range technical roles that our companies and the city needs into the future. So, we ask some really profound questions. What do you need from us? It's not just about us creating a thing that you will like. What do you really need from a heritage building and from a museum? So the museum opened in 2021. We wobbled with COVID, opened a bit late, but it's received about 200,000 visitors over the last year. We're running all sorts of projects and programs with our employers. Last week I was walking through the galleries and there were 200 young people working with Rolls-Royce apprentices on non-destructive testing, which is very popular. Doesn't sound as much fun as destructive, but it's encouraging young people to use knowledge they'll glean from school, work with young people that are in apprenticeships and are having that experience of work and developing a career. And so for us, we use this sort of slogan of being inspired by the makers of the past, made by the makers of today, and empowering the makers of the future. And that's really something that I think we've achieved with this museum.
Okay, so in that really interesting description, there are a number of different sort of, I suppose, social goods that you're sort of connecting that particular museum to. And this I want to sort of just draw us out a bit on this question about, I guess it's about the instrumental aspect of it, though I think it's not maybe entirely instrumental. But, the world of policy, and particularly the world of arts and culture funding, is a pretty instrumentally mediated landscape. How best can the contribution to these kind of social goods that Tony's talking about here, and you've all touched on, how can that best be explained, communicated, and also what sorts of ways are there available to us? What are the tools we might use to sort of measure, perhaps, or capture and measure things like the social relationships, the networks you talked about, as well as these other issues around employability, skills, and we'll get in a minute to pride, which is an even harder one, I think. James, can I just come back to you, because you touched on this. What's your sense, particularly reflecting back, I know it's some years ago, on your time in government, when you must have been operating in that kind of mental universe?
Yes, I think it's worth saying it's not pure evidence-based policy. Politics comes into it, personality comes into it. If you have someone like Chris Smith, who's genuinely interested and committed, that will make a difference to whether you get more funding for the arts. And if the Prime Minister and the Chancellor are interested, that makes a difference one way or the other. Similarly, a lot of it is also reacting to external factors. If you work in government, you're partly initiating, but you're also responding to the culture and the debate that you operate within. But I do think it is very important for people arguing for funding for culture, creative industries, to have a better set of tools. And this feels like something which is now genuinely being bottomed out. So there's a piece of work that Bennett are part of, Diane's part of, Patricia Kavinska, my organisation, a range of other people, are trying to take the analogy of the work around natural capital, which is now accepted by the Treasury, and a piece of work which I think you're also connected to, but which the HRC and DCMS have commissioned to go away and see whether you can calculate cultural and heritage capital. Really recommend the paper that is available on the DCMS website, and it's a brilliant attempt to try and be completist about pretty much all the things that we've talked about today. And I think the fact that it's been done and has been accepted with natural capital does change the debate a bit, because it means that you're building on a precedent. Equally, when you read it, I think, and it'd be interesting to come to this in questions, you're not going to come out with as simple a number as GDP or money. So at the very least, what it does, I think, is it means that when funding's being discussed, people who are arguing for investment in culture don't just get rolled over by people who can have other bigger numbers about GVA. So I think it's also a really good way for thinking through some of the things that we've been talking about today. It gives you a mental framework. If we can come out of it at the end of it with a number which feels something that can actually be operationalised by civil servants, that would be amazing. I'd be interested to know whether people in the work think that that's going to be done, or whether in the end it will be a way of thinking things through. And so much of what the number ends up being is dependent on your assumptions that it sort of, it doesn't, if it can get there, it would be brilliant. But I think at the very least what it does is it moves away from a very simplistic focus on economic growth money and GVA. If it can also, and it helps us organise our thinking. So the thing I was saying at the start about creativity enables adventurous consumers and creative workers, you know, in the framework, I think that would be enabling, would be the way that that's captured. So it gives you a way of saying, okay, well, that's not just a nebulous thing that you say anecdotally, that's a thing that we can theorise. If we can then also put a number on it, hallelujah, I think that would be transformational. But maybe to give a little anecdote, you know, there was a moment when Labour just got in and there was a demand by the Arts Council and a campaign led by Geoffrey Robinson to, Jerry Robinson, who was the chairman of the Arts Council, for, I think it was £100 million of extra money. And, you know, the way that was eventually done is Ed Miliband, who was the Treasury advisor, and I was number 10, the advisor working on culture. At the end, right at the end, after everyone had had a fight, people had had all of their final kind of flounces about, I haven't got enough money, you know, we had a meeting sort of half an hour before the document was finished, and Ed took 20 million quid out of one budget and put it, and that was, to a large extent, Ed cared about culture, and I cared about culture, and we were able, you know, if we cared about something else, we might have put our efforts into getting the 20 million from something else. So some of this is policy, some of this is evidence, and a lot of it is humans and politics as well.
Rebecca, I'm just curious in your thoughts on that, particularly coming from that question that you were posing about, you know, which is a very hard question, about how do we translate some of those sort of findings that are there in the sort of research that you've done and you've curated about, you know, the complexity, the nature of our attachment to places. But I mean, I'm curious also is whether there is any of the work in and around the Place programme which is trying to grapple with these questions.
Yeah, definitely. And I think if we accept, I really like your term, this sort of human-centred approach to culture, heritage and placemaking, and I think we also have to question whether our methods are fit for purpose within that rhetoric shift. And we've seen it in government with social fabric and social infrastructure, and there's a lot of rhetoric around pride and place. But then on the flip side of that is can we actually adequately get hold of it? And the technical annex, pleased to say, says in its infancy and exploratory, and I think that's a really great opportunity actually and a challenge for us in an academic sense and also in partnership with others. And I think there's three key things I think I'd like to add to that debate about how you communicate and measure the kinds of intangible, nebulous, elusive things that all our personal and collective emotions are. I think the first thing is that if you do embrace that human-centred view of the world, which puts emotion and economics in strong relationship with one another, conversation with one another, the way you communicate that is you have to enable and empower people to express themselves through the mediums that they feel most comfortable with. And that isn't always in a quantitative scale of how do you feel on a 1 to 10. It can sometimes be that, and there is a place for this complementarity between, it's not to the exclusion. But I think thinking about film and story and poetry, for example, as a way to get hold of the deep richness of our life course and the way that we relate to one another and with place and to place. So to give you an example of that, we have a project in the Place programme called Feeling Towns. And one of the things that they're trying to look at is how we capture pride in place through things like poetry and through a more explicit understanding of how we feel about particular places that perhaps could work together with quantitative measures, but perhaps could stand alone and be seen as valid evidence. So I think that's the kind of the first thing. And the second thing, I think, is we often forget about analysis of data. And one of the big things that we've found in the programme thus far has been that we've got all these wonderful ways now of collecting different kinds of data that perhaps we didn't have at the start of my career, and a really kind of creativity and a creative practice approach to that, which is really paying real dividends in getting hold of this kind of information. But there's a block in the system then in what we do with that. So around data analysis. So as your example showed, you know, there's the emotional power of an anecdote. How is that put into conversation with all of the other data that's coming out? And is there a skill set within decision making that can get hold of this complex qualitative, often material, and put that into conversation with the material we're more used to looking at on spreadsheets, for example. So that's the third thing. And I think the final thing to finish on a kind of another example from our project is it's all well and good collecting this and analysing it, but what does it then do? You know, what do we do in terms of the way that our places look, feel, and we act within them? And so another one of our projects in the Place programme is called Roots and Futures. It's working in Sheffield on the kind of heritage strategy and working with underserved communities and thinking about how do you work with groups that haven't often heard their voices and their feelings being heard within policy. And what they're trying to do within that is have a voices booklet, which is a creative output from the conversations they've had, and use that in a way that informs the heritage strategy. So in another example, we often see local development plans and frameworks with a foreword with a councillor. What if that was crowdsourced and written through oral histories, for example, of people's relationships with place? How might that approach change the way that the planning team then write that document? How might it change the way that a developer, an investor, or an architect looks at that document? And how might it change the relationship that people have with place as a result of that very simple and creative intervention at the start of a process that makes people feel valued? So I think there's a lot of complexity in there, but I'd say I feel much more confident, not just through the work of the Place programme, but others as well, that there are potential solutions here or ways forward that we can capitalise on that perhaps weren't there a few years ago.
Thank you. Tony, can I just come to you? And I suppose I want to, in a way, get you to reflect on James's anecdote there. The sort of that sort of story about how it's obviously one particular anecdote, but how funding decisions get made in at least the centrally directed funding that goes into the arts and culture. Does that to you sort of help make the case for a devolution? More devolution of funding, or because at the moment we have this very complicated funding landscape, a lot of which comes through local councils and is therefore very vulnerable to their overall fiscal position, as well as some centrally directed funding. What's your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, any funding that's going to have politicians involved is going to be, you're at the whims of the interest of the politicians, whether they're local councillors or whether they're cabinet members. So you can either answer this by saying, well, the cake's the same size. It's a question of how you just cut it up. Because obviously I've been working in an environment for the last 10 years where austerity has been outsourced to local councils, and our funding for the museums in Derby has been cut by 60% in the last 6 years, since 2015. Since 2015, we were getting 1.3 million pounds for the council. This year we get 610,000. So all that's been a huge transition to try and fill that gap with a whole range of other funding streams. And we're just that's just a microcosm of what's happening in regional cities across the country. So whether things are devolved to elected mayors or to combined authorities or to local councils, it's how you can use that money most efficiently, I think, is the first question. So the first area. So a combined authority potentially will have a little bit more buying power, maybe more ability to consolidate or to work together, some efficiency savings, and that might mean that you can get more value for money, but then you lose that local accountability, and you might then lose that connection with local people to their local assets and their amenities. So you can go from having Manchester is a really good example of a combined authority and the investment in culture, and it's got political stability, it's got buying power, it's able to consolidate at senior level, and it's very clear thinking. In the East Midlands, where you have a sort of we're operating in the East Midlands, you have a patchwork of authorities. The cultural infrastructure is much weaker, and it's much less impressive. And it goes from an investment like the £18 million in building a new museum in Derby to Erewash Museum in Ilkeston, which is about 6 miles away, plays a really important part in a community that would be characterised as being left behind, and is now facing cuts of 60,000 quid, which is not very much in the great scheme of things, but that's the difference between it being open 5 days a week and being open 3 days a week. And having a knowledgeable people working there, 3 knowledgeable people working there instead of 1. So that organisation in the winter set up a toy bank for its local community, and the cost of living has hit places like Ilkeston really hard. Visitor numbers went up 3 times during the winter period as people were coming in and exchanging toys and taking toys for Christmas. And unlike food banks, it wasn't means tested. So and people felt safe in that environment, and they really valued their organisation. But the reality is that there isn't enough buying power within that authority to keep that amenity, which means so much to people, open.
Thank you, guys. There are so many things I'd like to get into after we're just getting started, but it is the time to open up to the audience, both here and online. So if the people with the mics can get ready, I think I'm going to start with this side and then go over to that side. Yeah, I can see Henry here. You get a mic over here, sorry. It's the far corner of the room. We can all take a mental 5-second break while they mic. Just the chap there, 3 rows back. Just like.
Henry Murison from the Northern Power. So just responding to Tony's point really about Greater Manchester, I think that's a very fair observation. But I think it's worth saying that local government in London and the GLA doesn't really fund culture very much, whereas actually a lot of the northern and Midland cities actually do spend a lot of money on culture, and that sort of gets forgotten in this debate. That actually it's the regional cities that didn't have the Arts Council for so long. And now we do have them. Obviously, we have those like the ANO who've been very keen to throw mud rather than maybe accept the realities that we do need to redistribute things the way that James did with the BBC in Salford, and with decisions like the factory, which was is going to be probably one of the biggest single investments in a new arts building anywhere in Europe in this decade, and is happening in the north of England. So I'm really positive about the economic value of those interventions, but not in a reductive way, in that if you are going to look at the economic lens, let's not work out the value of everything in culture, but let's do the big things that do genuinely transform economies, and then do the things in our communities for the inherently good they do. And I think we've got into a really difficult place where we conflate very large-scale economic change with the genuine value of culture and communities, and argue that we should measure them the same way. Because I would say, actually, we measure economically far too much of the cultural sector and ignore the fact that the big decisions can have a huge impact if you make the right ones.
Thanks, Henry, and I'm glad you mentioned that, the sort of levelling up ambition, because I want to get to that. So I can see somebody just sitting at the back, the woman behind you, with a hand up in white.
Hi, I'm Eliza from Nesta. Really interesting and very compelling evidence around the importance of arts and cultural organisations in their local community. A lot of the previous panels have been talking about the increasingly choppy geopolitical waters that we find ourselves in, and I think I've noticed, I'm sure others have, cultural organisations in the UK and elsewhere finding themselves as part and parcel of that. You know, Putin talking about the Hermitage as part of Russian state military. We saw the Cardiff Philharmonic in a very well-meaning way banning a Tchaikovsky piece, and that being put on posters throughout Russia by the Kremlin. How do we sort of manage these really urgent local issues whilst sort of cultural organisations are also part, perhaps unknowing, of this giant sort of geopolitical context?
Very interesting question. And we'll take a third one in this round. I can see Andrew's hand there, just there with glasses.
Thank you. Andrew Pendleton. It builds on the last two in a way, actually, because I'm from the environment sector and struck by that issue about intrinsic value being such an important part of why people value the environment around them in the same way that it is for culture. So if we're... Economic value is a part of it, but moving beyond that, how do we get policymakers to buy into that idea that intrinsic value matters to everybody? If the panel could say more about that.
Great. Okay, so we've got, I guess I'm going to be a bit reductive about those questions, but so Henry's pointing in a way to one of the objectives in the Levelling Up programme about the sort of tilting of arts and culture funding. We've got this question about, you know, cultural organisations, how they deal with geopolitical issues, but I suppose we could add on to that other big contentious divides and questions about empire, heritage, and so on top of all of the other things that are going on. And then Andrew's question about this third question about, well, intrinsic value, can we make a case for that within the calculations of policymakers, decision makers? So I'm not going to give all of you each 3 of those. James, why don't you just start with the levelling up one, and then if you want to speak to one of the others, go for it.
Yes. Sorry, this is a bit of a trip down memory lane, but we were talking about Renaissance in the Regions, which was a project which, again, Chris Smith initiated in 1999, which was about, it was in the museum sector, and it was about investing money outside of London and getting partnership between London and non-London organisations. And I suppose 2 things are interesting about that. One is, at the time, it felt like quite a new issue. The big debate in that first Labour government was, in the arts, was around access versus excellence and whether having access meant dumbing down. And in a way, it felt like Chris was slightly opening a new issue. And it's interesting that now this feels like the dominant debate that we're discussing. I really worry that it's distracting us from the fundamental question about how much money. Actually, it become, the whole row about levelling up around the Arts Council was about £24 million. And Salford is a great example. The BBC's money was growing, and it was possible to do a big intervention like that because you could invest to make sure that it was done successfully, rather than it being set. It's obviously there's a lot of drama between if it's London versus the rest of the country, and you can see how people get snared into that. But actually, fundamentally, these are tiny amounts of money compared to the overall government budget, and it's the same. You were saying the funding is the equivalent to 3 kids in care or something like that. So care is incredibly important. It's a huge budget. I remember when I was at DCMS, spending weeks and weeks trying to find £1.5 million to give to English Heritage so that they didn't get their budget cut. I then went to DWP, Department for Work and Pensions, and decisions about £1.4 million wouldn't make it to a minister's desk. They'd barely make it to a junior official's desk. So it is possible, if we have the will, to find money for culture for that. And it is so much easier to do levelling up if it's genuine levelling up, because everybody's getting more money, rather than it being levelling up for some and levelling down for others. And I follow a little bit the debate about devolving arts funding, and obviously that's been opened up a little bit. I think the key thing is how you manage the ability to have excellence and regional equality. If you pass all the money into too many small pots, it will be very hard to fund the globally excellent organisations. What needs to be corrected, and I think we have made some progress on as a country, is they can't all be in London. So that excellence, national museums, essentially, that has been a closed shop funding, and most of that has been in London. NPOs for a long time, you just got the money every year, regardless of what you did. So that being opened up is absolutely right, but we need to combine it with making sure that we're funding the things which also can have that global stature. As I say, they just don't all need to be in the same city.
Okay, Tony, you may want to speak to that one, but I was also interested, whether you want to grapple with either of these other questions, the intrinsic value or the sort of wide, how these political issues kind of land on your world, really.
Well, I'll take the last one.
Yeah.
The easiest question, that one. If you look at museums on the most benign of levels, you could say that one of their sort of intrinsic strengths is that they can contextualise these global challenges by looking at local issues and speaking to the everyday experience of people in the locality or the heritage of a place in where they are. So a couple of examples. We have a collection of world cultures in our museum, like virtually every other civic museum in the country, and we know that a number of we have, through recent research, found that a number of those objects were part of loot from colonial violence and colonial war, especially in the Asante region of Ghana. So we've been working with diaspora communities in the city over a series of conversations about what should happen to these objects. And through working with those groups of individuals and communities, we've been able to build new connections with academics in West Africa, and it's likely that these objects are going to be repatriated. But the process of doing that with communities within the city has opened up a whole lot of other issues and understanding of our role as a kind of a repository of colonial, well, not just loot, but colonial artifacts, and the role the museum played in that building of, you know, of the civic realm in the 19th century. And then a more recent, we just opened a brilliant exhibition called Hogarth Britons, and it's a evocation of the Jacobite Rebellion. So when the Bonnie Prince Charlies invaded England, he got as far as Derby. He came to Derby for a week and a half, and then went back north again, and that was the end of the rebellion.
That was enough.
But yeah, it's enough for anyone. But it's a really important part of the city's local heritage. And through the eyes of Hogarth, we're able to tell that story. But also, we're talking about difficult relationships with our European neighbours. You know, a royal family at war, patriotism, and chauvinism induced readily. So these are really, you know, redolent contemporary things that can be seen in a historical context. And when we frame it like that, that's been really helpful, I think, and for our city to see that heritage and history is not something that is, you know, preserved in aspect, but can be used to frame the challenges that we're facing today.
That's very interesting. Rebecca, which of those would you like to talk to?
All and none.
All and none. Well,
I'll go with the intrinsic one because
Okay.
I think there's more I could possibly say, and I
Okay.
think we've covered the other two as well. So I think that's the big $1 million question, if you like. And I think there's a couple of things I'd like to say directly in relation to that. The first is to not separate out the personal from the professional. So I think when we think about intrinsic value, in my language, emotional, I think Hewison, the spiritual, whatever that definition was from years ago, of intrinsic value, I think we have a tendency to sort of silo the professional decision-making and the personal sense of self that we all have. And I did a large research project where I worked with a range of different built environment professionals to understand where emotion factored into decision-making. And what I came out with was that it factors across the urban development cycle. So emotion and economics are in hand at different places. We just perhaps don't notice it in the same way that we notice other things because we don't capture it, because we don't have to. So I think that's the first thing I'd want to say is the kind of myth that we separate ourselves out into the personal and professional. The second thing I'd like to say is that, as with everything, if it's evidence-based policy, it's evidence. So to give you another example from the PLACE programme, another example another project called Art is Everywhere, which is based in North Lanarkshire. And what it's trying to do is embed the arts throughout public service provision. And I think and it's been fantastically successful, and I think once we get to see and really deeply understand, not just as Henry was saying, the kind of economics of that, but the kind of emotional, relational, social, human aspects of that, I think the goal is that perhaps you end up with better places. Better is subjective, but more sensitive places, and perhaps people with a better sense of self and relationships to one another and life courses and such like. So I think there is evidence that's needed, but I'd say again, I'm much more confident now that we have those kinds of examples than perhaps we did in the past, because we are thinking about this. It's a mindset shift that's happened. So I think that's kind of really the two things that I would say is that the professional and the personal and the evidence. And my confidence, I don't think it's naive optimism, my confidence is that there's a lot of examples, not just in academia, but with a lot of think tanks and local organisations, Power to Change, Local Trust, Institute of Community Studies, for example. They're all developing this evidence base that I think we can use productively.
Excellent. Several of them are represented here, so that's a great answer. James.
I mean, just quickly, as well as that fantastic answer, there's some sort of slightly pragmatic things that you can do. Put future politicians on your boards. You know, spot councillors, you know, people who are advisors. There's nothing like being on the board of an organisation about the environment or about the arts to get people turning up to premieres, coming to shows, understanding why it matters, understanding. And, you know, Ed Miliband was on the board of the Royal Court. He had seen firsthand the benefits and the difficulties of being in an arts organisation. So I think that's something really practical that people can do. then the other thing is people getting involved in politics. You know, if people go into politics believing that these issues matter, you can make a massive difference and it will come down to leadership at some point. That Paul Keating example is an example of someone who believed in it and who made that a big priority.
Okay, so I've got a question here I'm going to put that's come through online. Whilst this side of the room ponders its questions, I'll come to you shortly. Just one online question here, which I'm going to put, I think, first to Rebecca, actually, because I think it speaks very directly to what you've been saying. How can the desire to celebrate the industrial past of cities and towns be squared with the reality of a de-industrial future? How can heritage and history be used to articulate a positive vision for the future? Which is, echoes a sort of wider challenge that's often made, isn't it, to the heritage sector and to calls for funding for it?
Yeah. I think my kind of simple answer would be to start with the everyday experiences of the people who are living in those particular places, and to think about what they value and why they value it. So it might be the built fabric, it might not be the built fabric, it might be the relationships that are housed in and between that particular built environment. And so perhaps start with the intangible and the relationship to the tangible. I think we've had a history really of starting with the built fabric and starting with the tangible, the things we can get hold of, we can sell, we can own in particular ways, but perhaps start differently. And I think within that, when we think about what the value of something is going forward and how we're productive about that, so we also have to recognise complexity and contestation. And that the post-industrial future is one that is hard to navigate. My own research has shown that very clearly, to me at least. And I think what we're seeing in that is that there are tensions in the way in which we think of the past and how it takes us into the future. And I think one of the things we need to be better at is sitting with that complexity, not putting a USP over it, a unique selling point of this is the post-industrial future and everybody get behind it, but being able to sit with those difficult emotions and that difficult complexity in ways that validate where people are, where they've been, and where they want to go as well. So what their skill set looks like and what the soft infrastructure and the social infrastructure is around them that they need to be able to prosper in terms of their sense of self, but also the economic development of place as well. So my starting point, again, is what's working now for the people that are in those places and how you take that and use that as a strength going forward.
I mean, I strongly agree with that. And I mean, just to bring some findings from work that we've done I was very struck in the course of the paper we did on Pride in Place. I mean, there's quite a lot of polling data that tends to suggest that one of the most important divides, you've alluded to several, but is a demographic one, that younger people just tend to feel very differently about what the heritage of their place should be, what its identity is, how that should be defined. And, one of the challenges here for those involved in the heritage sector and museums and so on is to think about, if we start from where we are, I suppose the risk is that we fall into assuming that we should continue the same kinds of provision because, there are enough people coming to them, but that can still miss swathes of the community. So I think that sense of being open to how this is contested, and often not openly contested, I think is really important. But anyway, we've had enough time for this side of the room to, so can we get the mics over here, Tola? I can see the woman there.
Hello, I'm Katie Thornborough. I'm a local councillor here in Cambridge, but leading on the next local plan. We've got some great planning officers here I work with. We're really interested in well-being and social inclusion policies in the next local plan, and it's fascinating what you're saying about culture. I wonder if you know about food culture, the wealth of local food culture, and how we could work with our diverse communities to understand more about how they grow, share eating experiences and celebrating through food. We've got traditional pubs we probably might understand, and markets and now food hubs. But is there much more? I feel there's much more we could learn through our food culture, but it's how do we reach out to those people? And is there any evidence already that you might be working on or gathering?
Okay, thank you. We'll take two more. The woman behind in white at the back there.
Hi, I'm Eunice. I'd like to ask, how well does culture necessarily fit in with place-based policy, especially when we're talking about digital culture? So for example, in Leveling Up, in the white paper, one of the goals is to make sure that like the UK has lots of globally competitive cities. So perhaps encouraging digital culture could elevate the international status of these cities. But at the same time, how do we turn this into tangible value for these cities? Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. And then, sorry, Tyler, right at the front. This guy's been very patient.
Thank you. So my question was, with limited funding and struggles with distributing said funding, is there much in place to ensure that our more deprived communities can actually benefit from this as well? Because, to me, the benefits we might see could be perhaps even greater with these communities. Let's think maybe crime in young adults or isolation for the elderly. And how can we ensure that these communities that might not be the natural patrons of cultures and the art, how are we making sure that we include them rather than leave them behind? Thank you.
Thank you. So 3 really good questions there. So the first one on sort of well-being, social inclusion, but particularly with reference to food culture. Would you like to take that, Tony?
There's the Food Museum exists in Stowmarket, which is not 30 miles from Cambridge. So I'd encourage you to talk to the Food Museum in there. But obviously food culture is a really important part and almost kind of goes into the sort of non-tangible heritage area. But I think there are many cities up and down the country that use food as that kind of way in to other cultural activities with communities, especially those that perhaps don't access or choose to, or not access, they don't choose to visit institutions. But I would start with the Food Museum.
Excellent. I like a nice concrete answer. So to the second one, James, this question, which I think is a really interesting point about, is there a tension here between, there are certain kinds of cultural creativity and skills that we want to promote as a country, and particularly when it comes to digital skills, how does that connect with a place-based focus?
It's a brilliant question, and actually it's such a big topic that Patricia and colleagues in the paper I referred to decided it was too big to cover in their methodology. So maybe you should do a paper on it to explore that issue, because it's a huge and really important issue, and as you say, it's one which is potentially growing. I think fundamentally it must be an opportunity. Digital, one of the things it does is it collapses the constraints of space. And a lot of the issues that we've been talking about are because wanting to spread investment around the country, is just as you were just saying, is a tricky, complicated issue because it's a zero-sum game. Actually, digital overcomes a lot of those problems because people can access culture from anywhere. I think it also reminds us to widen out the lens to include broadcasting and media and social media. I think, in particular, the BBC is a way, and just bringing those 2 questions together, for culture to be spread everywhere. Art is Everywhere was supported by the BBC, that combination of broadcast and great culture is something that we mustn't forget as part of this. I suppose the point about the third question is, yes, that's absolutely right. I think that's something where arts organisations have really transformed what they do now. I think every publicly funded arts organisation is or should be thinking about how they reach people who aren't the natural people coming into their buildings or consuming their content. I think Free Musings made a big difference to that, but it's just the starting point. You have to do the hard work of Ruth Mackenzie at the Nottingham Playhouse, or Peter Sellers and the operas that he's done traditionally, working to have an incredibly diverse set of people being part of it, but as a way of making really great work.
Tony, did you want to come in?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think there's the assumption that the kind of existing cultural infrastructure is enough. So we did some research back in 2017, focusing on areas of the city where we know people aren't accessing culture, they're not choosing to come to our museum or to theatres or whatever. And the stuff that came from the research is that actually those communities have got really strong degrees of social capital. They've got strong families. They will they have very rich social lives. They just choose not to go to the recognised forms of culture. They choose not to get on the bus and go to the museum. But they'll go to parks, they'll go to theme parks, they'll go to festivals in their communities. So there's still, whilst culture is much, in the 20 years I've been working, is more accessible, there's still, the cultural capital gaps have still got to be breached. And actually they are, if the economic gap was the challenge of the 2000s when free admission came in, the cultural capital gaps are the challenges for the 2020s.
Can I just follow up though on that, because it is a very important question. I mean, I wonder if there's more of a dilemma there for the policymaker or the funder than perhaps that suggests, because there are a lot of funding, particularly. I mean, I know we've just had that. There was that big settlement around the capital expenditure thing, but that, what that shows is that a lot of the things we're talking about are expensive. Buildings are expensive. The upkeep of these kind of institutions carries significant cost. But on the other hand, there are, as your example shows, and there's been other studies that show this, there are lots that culture is happening in lots of places, even if people are not accessing some of our more conventional institutions. If you're a funder, I mean, does that present a dilemma? Is there an argument that should be made that actually more funding, in relatively, given these things are scarce, should be going in that direction?
You get much more bang for your buck with that kind of funding, if you're not funding buildings, if you're not funding bricks and mortar. So it actually doesn't cost very much. So one of the problems with levelling up, the levelling up and out, is that the focus is on capital. So the councils or communities are given quite large amounts of capital to spend within a very short period of time, on the basis that culture will help renew town centres. So Wakefield Council, for instance. So my first job in 1999 was working at Wakefield Museum, and I was subbing for the curator who was putting a lottery bid together to redevelop the museum in this lovely old mechanics institute. She got the money. The museum was refurbished in 2000. It had to shut in 2012 because of council cuts. It was relocated to the council offices in 2013. And then last year, the council was given £15 million to build a new museum and library in an ex-British home stores in Wakefield city centre. So in the space of 20 years, you've gone from an existing cultural place, perfectly good cultural place, shut it down, move it to the council offices, build something new in a shopping centre. And it's all the focus is on buildings, bricks and mortar and capital, and not embedding a sense of pride in all the things that Rebecca's talked about in those communities, and to understand the place where they live and to use the place where they live as that kind of bridging space.
Great. So we really have a few minutes left, so I'm going to take two more questions and then we will wrap up from this little section. Yeah, the guy there.
One of the previous questions, my name is Keith Herman, one of the previous questions was about a de-industrial or post-industrial future. First of all, I'd like to question the assumption that we make about that. I think we really need to have a conversation about what that means, because for hundreds of years we've had an amazing, incredible maker history, and it's almost as if we just chucking that in the bin because, hey, we make more money out of financial services. But my question is about talent, and Tony goes to your point about the story about this amazing fabric of social and cultural capital that you have supporting and engaging with employers around their future talent needs. My question to you and the panel is how long-term do you think those stakeholders understand the task at hand? And to give you an idea, you spoke about non-destructive testing. That's a key requirement for building turbines that go into jet engines that Rolls-Royce makes. That's a craft skill that takes years and years to develop. So how committed are our stakeholders and our policymakers in thinking really long-term about the future talent needs that we have in our towns and regions around the country, and how do we ensure that they commit the resources that we need to deliver that talent for the future?
Thank you. And there's time for one more question. I can see a hand there in the middle.
Hey, Arthur. I apologise if this sounds provocative. I have this concern that it sounds provocative. It genuinely comes from just a place of interest. How do you think the role of cultural institutions changes in periods of economic crisis and social recession, as opposed to just over time when the collective zeitgeist changes?
So you've stolen the question that I was thinking of putting in if I hadn't gone to you. So I'm really pleased you said that. So just the first one on talent. I mean, Tony, that was kind of directed at you, but maybe James, you might want to jump in as well. You go first, Tony.
So, yeah, you're quite right, and you have much more knowledge than I do about Rolls-Royce turbofans. But the industry still exists, and so Rolls-Royce working on a project with us about nuclear. So Rolls-Royce are developing these small modular nuclear reactors, which are allegedly part of the decarbonisation mix, and whether you see that as a thing or not, but they need those engineers to work on to be part of that pipeline. And if the museum or any cultural institution is that first spark in someone's ambition to pursue a career there, then that's when that institution is, I think, it's succeeding. And it's capturing all of those. Some of that will be anecdotally, some of that can be measured, but it's ensuring that we as organisations are documenting and making sure that this happens. But I think that the post-industrial thing is important because it's not just about work and things, it's about the communities that exist. And the communities that, the industrial communities of the future are not necessarily, living back to back. They're virtual communities, they're communities of interest, they're communities that don't necessarily exist in one place. So it's just a new form of community.
Great. So I'm going to put the final question to each of you, and I want a really brief answer, which is, as I understand it, to kind of draw you back to the economic aspect, the economic crisis bit of this, because you began, James, talking about, I think both of you talked about COVID, and that obviously has been a very important sort of crisis moment in which we've learned lots of things and questions have arisen. But these we're now living in slightly different, if related maybe, crises, the cost of living, the energy crisis. What particularly are the challenges that those pose for the kind of arguments for culture and cultural value that you're making? James, start with you.
It's a great question, isn't it? I mean, obviously culture has a role in good times and bad times. I guess I would hypothesize maybe drama is better in difficult times. Think about your favourite pieces of art. They're normally about moments of historical inflection at some point. But obviously it's got relevance in both. Thinking back to the pre-financial crisis, the years before that, the debate was about, we're doing well economically, but why aren't we happy enough? And the arts had a big role to play in that. But I suppose more concretely, they should be counter-cyclical. At a time when advertising or subscription fund revenues are lower, then in an ideal world, public funding should compensate, and certainly the BBC's funding did do that to a certain extent in broadcasting. If I can have a tiny bite of the talent question, we are, and it links a bit to the session earlier on data and how it can be used. We're incredibly successful at creative education in this country, and it's great that we now have data on the economic outcomes of people going to university. People who do creative degrees, unsurprisingly, do less well than people who do law or financial degrees. That data has been interpreted to say that creative education is a bad investment. Actually, it's funding the creative industries, and or the pipeline for the creative industries, and if you believe my other argument, it's also central for everything else. So I suppose it's a way of linking the point earlier that data is incredibly useful, but can also be hugely misused.
Thank you. Rebecca?
I'll try and be really quick, and I didn't think it was that provocative, sorry. You can rest easy maybe from my perspective. I'm a historian, so I think there's something to say about the temporal sort of oscillations of cultural institutions and other things as well. two key things there. I think stability and purpose. So the purpose of a cultural institution or whatever historic organisation will have a long-term purpose, I imagine. And I think what a crisis gives us is the chance to check that purpose, to refresh that purpose, and to then think about how we reframe the ways that we do within that context of that purpose. So I think there's something there about having something that underpins over time, that is open and flexible to change, and perhaps crisis is the point at which where you start, as we've seen, to be able to refresh within that context.
Thank you. Tony?
The long-term purpose, my organisation has been going for 234 years. So I often reflect on the long-term purpose, but it's got to change. It has to change all the time, though.
Yeah.
But that sense of stability is also really important too. So the mixture of the two. So occasionally I go back to the curator's book, which is like a captain's log that is unfortunately been discontinued. But one of my predecessors worked during the Second World War, and we've got some really interesting anecdotes that he wrote about his experience of working in a time of disruption. So interspersed between him complaining about the council not coming to fix his windows when the windows were broken,
changes.
he talks about working with refugee communities in the city, encouraging exhibitions from the work of children of Polish families that have moved to England during the Second World War. He talked about exhibitions and work encouraging people to understand local food and the need to understand the environment in which they live in. So I'll kind of always go back sometimes to the heritage of our organisation to put our feet on the ground, but to remember that we've been responding to disruption and to stability for hundreds of years.
Thank you. That's a really great note on which to end. We've all learned, I think, a lot from this session. We've got 2 new museums to visit. We are all going to come to Derby and to Stowmarket, it should be said. But it just remains for me to thank our 3 speakers who've done a terrific job, I think, in front.